G'day everyone. My name is Michael Buckland. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute, and welcome to our panel discussion tonight. We're really excited to have you all joining us, especially at this tough hour in the witching hour in Australia, but also for Betsy, the very opposite. I think it's very early in the morning, so thank you, Betsy, for joining us from the States. We're here to discuss something that really comes down to why think tanks like us and people who are interested in policy exist. And that is, how do we get big reforms to start happening? How do we get big reform through the political process? How do we embed it? And really, those debates have been a very difficult challenge over the last few years. And so we're asking the question, is big reform dead in a post-COVID world, or can we get it going again? And if we can, what are those reforms? What should we be on the lookout? And so we're joined by some esteemed panelists here who I'll introduce in a moment. We love participation and we want you to ask questions, so please do so. You can do it through the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar. So just type it in there and we'll try and get to it as we go throughout the show. Unfortunately, we can't get to all your questions, but we'll see what we can do. To start, I'd love to introduce Betsey Stevenson. Betsy worked in many different roles throughout US politics and economics over the last few years. She was the chief economist for the Department of Labor many years ago, and then served President Obama as on his Council of Economic Advisors. That was during a particularly tough period shortly after the global financial crisis. And so it was really at the forefront of so much in economic reform. She now sits as a professor of public policy at the University of Michigan, as well as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She's recently been in Sydney with, I think on you're working with the University of Sydney a little bit, is that right, Betsy?
I do have affiliations with the University of Sydney, but I was mostly doing remote work. So I even started my time in Australia finishing up on the Biden-Harris transition team. Because, when everybody's doing things remote, you can be anywhere in the globe.
I guess that's great for everything except maybe your work hours. So we tried to reach out to you when you were here, but we're glad we were able to make it tonight. Thank you. We're also joined by Angela Jackson, who is the lead economist at Equity Economics. She was also a deputy chief of staff to a minister for finance and deregulation, and so has worked at very high levels. She's a regular commentator and deputy chair of the Women in Economics Network, and a good friend of the McKell Institute. So thank you so much for joining us, Angela.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's great here.
We're thrilled. And we're, of course, joined by Craig Emerson, who is no stranger to those of you who are familiar with the McKell Institute. Craig has been a minister in so many different roles and part of some of the biggest reforms that Australia has managed to embed over the last, 10 years or so, although it's maybe slowed down in the years since you've left, Craig. But Craig's also the chair of the McKell Institute and managing director of Emerson Economics. And so thank you so much for joining us, Craig.
Well, good, Michael.
So Betsy, could I start with you and ask what you think of, you've spent a little bit of time in Australia recently. What do you think of the current state of reform in Australia versus the United States? And do you hold a lot of hope for progress going forward?
Well, I think the United States is right now in a wave of pushing for really big reform. You've seen, a $3.5 trillion package that looks like it might actually move. There's a lot of big ideas out there coming out of the Biden administration for how we might completely reform the social contract in terms of supporting children and supporting care work and investing in people's future. This has been I think, a big part of the agenda of Democrats over the last decade. But the problem in the United States is that even if you get to be president for 8 years, like President Obama was president for 8 years, you've got really only 2 years to get things through a legislative window. So if you're either going to get it passed at that beginning of your first term, or you face midterm elections in which you may lose control, which we see happen periodically, of the House and Senate. And so every president, I think, and you can go back historically way past, many, many decades, and you see every president in the United States, they hit the ground running. It's why so much work actually gets done in developing policy proposals on the campaign in great detail, not because you need those to campaign or to run, but because you need to be ready to go from day one. And it's a lot of, I worked on the Biden-Harris transition, and a lot of that was really like being exactly ready on day one to sign executive orders, to start getting your legislative agenda ready to go. I think that when it comes to Australia, obviously you've had one big reform, which is you closed your borders, and that's obviously pretty drastic policy changes. But I think that Australia faces the same problem that basically every democracy faces, which is when you give people something, it's really, really hard to take it away. And I think that's what makes what we think of as big reform difficult in every single country. When you talk about like the United States, I like to give examples of things people don't realize. Like, we have healthcare only for people who are over the age of 65. That was a political compromise that the people who made the compromise thought, oh, well, once we give it to people over the age of 65, we'll be able to come back and get it for younger people. Well, we're like 70 years later, and the United States still doesn't have, access to healthcare for people under the age of 65. We haven't taken it away from the people over 65. That persists, but we haven't really been able to move that reform needle. So there's I'm always shocked when I look at how much policy is out there. We call big reform, like, is it really purposeful? I describe it as being on the knife's edge of it could have happened, it could have not happened. And once it happens, it tends to stick with us.
Well, I couldn't think of anything more drastically different. I mean, Craig, tell me how getting that preparation before government, how that compares with maybe your time and the most recent government, which I think we've talked a lot about, maybe has done very little during the pre-election period and doesn't have much of an agenda.
Well, it's fascinating listening to Betsy, because probably in the Australian tradition, if you're not in government, but then do land in government in an election, you will have ideas, and quite well articulated ideas, but nothing that is close to being a piece of legislation. We do then rely heavily on the public service to draft that up, and also to give some advice. And you talk, Betsy, about healthcare. In 1972, Gough Whitlam brought in universal healthcare in the form of Medibank. He lost in 1975, and they did get rid of it. But then in 1983, Bob Hawke, when Labor was re-elected after 7 years, announced Medicare, and the Conservatives tried to get rid of it about 4 times until it got to a ridiculous stage. They were so bruised and battered by trying to get rid of it that Tony Abbott, who later became Prime Minister, when he was Shadow Health Minister, said the Liberal Party is the best friend Medicare ever had. So it became so entrenched that they said, oh, look at us, we're telling you, we're not going to touch it. So sometimes you just got to get something in and just really lock it in, as you say. So I think while there will be attempts to modify Medicare, which we would oppose, they're not going to get far now. It is really well entrenched. The other quick point I'd make, Michael, is there's an old saying, never waste a good crisis. And it's really quite hard to get reform in when people don't see the need for it. When things are going okay, do we want to really upset the apple cart? Do we want to do all this stuff? The hawk period was at the end of a very nasty recession. And now here we are at the end of, hopefully the end of another one, this one brought on by a medical crisis. And it would be a terrible waste if there was a sense that in the Australian economy, we just need to go back to where we were around late 2019, because everything's okay. Because it wasn't. We had very low wage growth. We had no obvious sources of future economic growth and prosperity. And there is this kind of sense from the conservative side of politics, look, if we could just get back to where we were, that'd be great. And on the progressive side, they say, no, we want, and this is a borrowed phrase, we want to build back better. I think it's the Labor Party in the UK might have created that term, but I like it a lot.
Angela, do you think we've wasted the crisis?
Well, they certainly wasted their first crack at it in terms of the federal government. I think state government's probably done a bit better in terms of reform and changes. And, we saw in Victoria, for example, mental health reform, which had associated with it a mental health levy. So you did have losers, but then, major reform. But the federal government, yes, very much. It was, stimulus, nothing really reform orientated about it at all. Some money spent on mental health as well, but a fraction of what was needed. I hope they don't waste this next opportunity, because obviously, we are in another recession and there is going to have to be another recovery package coming out of this, that they use it as an opportunity for real reform and real investments, even if, they don't necessarily involve losers in the sense of probably big reform always does involve a vested interest losing something, or, there is always going to be a negative side often to a big reform. But certainly it would be, I think to date, they have wasted it.
And I saw you'd done a fair bit of work looking at some of the social infrastructure out of the United States. Do you think that's something that might get borrowed out of the $3 trillion infrastructure package? I should be clear. Is that a new way of looking at things, this social infrastructure, maybe in light of the need for social support through a pandemic? Is that a new way of thinking?
Look, I would hope so. I mean, whether the Liberal Party is capable of that thinking, we'll wait and see. But I think certainly, the idea of investing in your people coming out of a pandemic would seem to make sense. We have seen, the pandemic obviously have a huge impact on people's health, their mental health. We've seen it have a big impact on employment. And the time is ripe to reinvest in people. The other thing that I hoped that people would understand from the pandemic was the concept that, disadvantage isn't something necessarily that happens because people have done the wrong thing, that things can sometimes just happen to people and that we need to back them and invest in them. Whereas Australia's system, when it comes to, whether it's unemployment benefits or the employment system more broadly, is really about penalising people, that you've done the wrong thing and we're going to punish you. And if we somehow punish you, then you'll get a job, rather than seeing it as a chance to invest in those people. Whether there's been that change of thinking on a global, on a sort of a holistic scale, I don't know. But look, they did do some investments in terms of aged care, which was, good to see. They have invested some money in mental health. Again, great to see. But we need a lot more. And I think coming out of this next downturn, it would be good to see, doubling up on those mental health, fully implementing the PC Productivity Commission, recommendations, and really investing in people going forward, rather than, this approach that we've had in this country of punishing people when they're down and out, if you like.
You can even just see that in comparing our COVID ads to the others, which is more scaremonger than positivity. But Betsy, to you again, we talked a little bit about COVID highlighting some of the big differences, but another impact of COVID can be, with all this uncertainty, we start to, are we afraid of change, or do you think we can embrace it? Certainly, you're saying now's the moment in the States. In Australia, we seem to have a very different answer. Do you think COVID's impacting this, or do you think it's just the political cycle generally, like you mentioned?
Oh, so I think COVID is having a big effect. So first of all, I have to tell Craig that Build Back Better is the Biden agenda. So that is like the Big Back Better agenda, White House. You can Google that; it'll show up right away.
I knew I'd seen it somewhere.
And that I think that was, Angela had mentioned at one point, there's this idea coming out of the Trump administration. I think that frames some of it, but it was really about coming out of COVID, build back better coming out of COVID. I think what we've seen Australia is living at 2020 right now, and the rest of the world's in 2021. So let me tell you what the world is like in 2021. So after 18 months of shutdowns, of caseloads rising, of hospitals being full, people are changing what they expect from work, from home, from the government. The thing is, the problem is Australia got these halcyon days where you shut your borders, you kept COVID at zero, and everybody was like, let's just go back to living like it was 2019. So it does not surprise me at all that there are a lot of Australians that are very attached to the idea that you might go back to 2019 any day now. Americans held on to that idea all through 2020, and we have abandoned it now. You guys will abandon it eventually, because your dream of COVID zero is sadly very over. Whether everybody's completely accepted that or not, I think that's what the numbers show, and that's where the caseloads are going. So what is it that's happened that's so different? One is that there's just been rapid technology adoption, and I've seen that in Australia as well as seeing it in the United States. Australia was very slow for things like online shopping, and now everybody's stuck at home and they're thinking, oh, click and collect. Yeah, I guess I will do that. Purchasing things online, using this kind of meeting. We're having this event over Zoom. That has permanently shaped business travel in the United States and around the globe. People are very reluctant to adopt new technologies, and it means that we're very slow to move in that direction usually. And the pandemic forced a real break. So I describe the United States as we're sort of in 2030 right now when it comes to where we would have been with technology adoption if we hadn't had the pandemic. So if we sped ahead in terms of that, what is that going to mean for what we expect from our government, from how we work and how we shop and how we do things? I do think that, like in the United States, childcare became a huge focus. It's still a big focus. And then I think if you look globally, we're watching governments spend more money than they've ever spent before. We're looking at the threat of inflation, and it's this very weird time where we've had interest rates globally really pegged quite low because of what you might think of as an international savings glut. And yet we have government spending like crazy. I think to Angela's point, I want to start asking questions like, what's my government spending on? Is it an investment, or is it money that, is it, I don't want to call it wasteful, but is it consumption for today? Is the government having a big party with my money, or are they doing something that's going to mean in 10, 20, 30 years, we're more productive as a society? And given these big amounts of money that are being spent, we've got to start asking, how is that money being spent, and what's the kind of return we're getting on those dollars? So I think that those are the kinds of questions Australians are going to start to have as well. I do think you guys are lagging a little bit behind where some of the countries that have been really hit hard, for 2 years now with the pandemic are at.
Well, I certainly think if Craig had his way, we wouldn't be so far behind, because he's done a lot of work in childcare, and so is the McKell Institute, looking at childcare and early childhood education as an economic reform. And I'm reminded by someone in the audience at the moment that Infrastructure Australia is looking at proposing social infrastructure for the first time. So Craig, can you talk us through, is free or better discounted childcare, better access to childcare, an example of what economic reform could be out of the pandemic?
So, and the thinking behind it, obviously it's a very important social reform, but we at McKell and the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party that picked up the policy have been criticised for giving childcare subsidies to wealthy women. And we've said, well, no, if kids go to school in a government school, no matter how wealthy their parents are, they get a free education. If those kids get sick, they get free healthcare in Medicare. Why should it be in childcare that is only available to people on lower incomes, and then phased out at really rapid rates such that the work disincentives for women who have partners whose income is counted for the childcare subsidy find that they're losing 70, 80, even 120 cents in every extra dollar earned. So it is an important economic reform. As a nation, we gladly, joyfully invest in the talents of women through university and then say, now, but be very careful. We don't want you working more than 2 or 3 days a week. It's absurd. So I think we probably won that debate like we won the debate on Medicare. And it's going to be very, very hard in the future for governments to say, no, only childcare support for low income people, and we don't care what the work disincentives are for women, just as long as for blokes, they're not higher than 47 cents in the dollar. It's absolutely absurd. But it does raise the broader issue, and that is, what are the attitudes going to be to very large budget deficits on an ongoing basis? And this comes to macroeconomic policy, it comes to quantitative easing, it comes to the more conventional neoclassical view that you can't just keep spending, it's got to be paid for out of future generations and so on. And I think that's going to be one of the really big debates in the coming years, because my view is that while capacity we're operating at way below capacity, including in the labour market, then continuing with deficits is not detrimental. But as soon as I say that, Conservatives will say, see, he's reckless. But just try winding back on, the monetary policy that you've been talking about, Betsy, and then it will get horrendous because the markets will react savagely of tapering quantitative easing and so on. So what I'm saying is that the whole question that we started with is, can we have reform, really is attached to that issue of whether we can afford reform. And I say we can, but there will be a lot of people, including in the US Congress on the Republican side, who say we just can't afford to do this.
Well, that's a great segue, but can I ask Angela almost 2 questions here, but one from Katja, who's come through on the Q&A, but is about how we motivate the government to build back better with a focus on sustainability and renewable energy. And I mentioned that in the context of what Craig just said about our attitude to debts. So how do we do this simultaneous dance with what should our attitude to that fiscal stimulus be, and also renewable energies? And then maybe after that, just throw open to Betsy and Craig for your comments on that.
So yeah, look, I think the question of climate change, obviously coming out of even COVID, obviously is the other big crisis that the world is facing. And it is, from the government's perspective in Australia, it has been a reform that obviously the Labor government, tried. We implemented the reform and then it was disbanded straight away by the new Liberal government. And now we've almost walked away from it. So we're relatively close. And I know we have tougher targets, but in terms of saying we're going to have a market mechanism, for example, the Labor Party is no longer signing up to that big reform, if you like. How do we do it? Well, I think the first thing in any reform is to say, well, what's the need, right? So you have to generate the compelling case for the need for reform. And that can be done through circumstance. So, if things are going really badly in economy, for example, as Craig said before the Hawke Keating government came in, then the situation itself compels the need. With climate change, I think there is an understanding across the Australian people now that this is real and we need to address it. But we probably need to do more about that, about what is the actual need, so that then the reforms almost follow. It's almost the natural next step is the reform, because you've created the problem, you've explained what the problem is, and then you create, well, this is the solution and this is how we go out of this. And there will be losers within climate change, and that has been the sticking point in Australian politics, particularly about where those losers are, because politically they're in marginal seats and that makes change very difficult. But it is about explaining to people what is that journey. It's about political will and it's about leadership. Will we get that from Scott Morrison? I think it's going to be really interesting. He is going to have to sign up. I think he's going to be pretty much forced to sign up to a hard, 50% net zero by 2050 target. He's going to have plans of how we're going to get there, and that's going to take government investment and reform, because it's not sort of an easy, let's just sign the piece of paper and it will happen. There is a lot of work to be done, a lot of investment, a lot of spending to be done by governments to get us there. Is it a good idea to do that as part of a COVID recovery? Of course, right? Because you get the double benefit of the economic benefit, the stimulus benefit, plus you get a long-term reform out of it. Will they do it? That's, the political conundrum in Australia, obviously, is, he relies on the National Party for votes in the Parliament. They are heavily funded by the coal lobby in this country, and that creates a political stalemate that is very difficult to navigate. Is he the man to do it? Maybe. I'm not sort of 100% convinced on that. But, I think the main point, I guess, for those that want the reform is to keep making the case for the need and the problem, because I think then the people do go along with the solution. And we've seen that in Australia, I think, time and time again when big reform has happened, because we do have quite a lot of success with it. And I think around the NDIS, for example, which was probably the biggest reform after Medicare that the Gillard government introduced, there was a huge public campaign to present the issues there. There was a public acceptance of the need, and everyone accepted an increase in their taxation, something that, as a political advisor, I wasn't in politics at that point, but, we would have said, no, you can't give people a tax rise, not, especially across the board tax rise for everybody. But people accepted that because they saw the need and they got on board with the campaign. So I guess coming to the end of my answer, not to keep going and to take the platform for too long, I think coming out of COVID is a time where it's ripe for reform. I think this has been, and I understand Betsey's point, we haven't had the full gamut of it, although in Melbourne we feel like we have, because we've been locked down for a very long time here. And while we haven't had the deaths and the despair, it's certainly been a transformative period. People want change at this point. I think people are ripe for that big reform, those big ideas. I think what has gone on has changed people's perspectives and probably changed people's risk profile as well to strive for more, to want more. But at the moment, across the political spectrum, we're not getting those solutions at all. We're sort of getting this idea of it's all okay, everything's safe. And I actually think there's a lot more appetite out there than we probably give people credit for at the moment.
So can I just, because I am conscious of time and it's sort of snuck up on me because I'm having such a great time chatting to you all. But one of the things we really wanted to get to before we started to wind up, but was, so what should the next reforms be? What is the next step? So I'd like to prompt something. In New South Wales, there's a big proposal for getting rid of stamp duty and replacing it with land tax. In the United States, land tax isn't a very new idea. It's an old idea, certainly in some places. There's talk about the electric vehicles tax, but are these what we need? Or are there, if you could put one or two ideas on the table, what would they be? Can I get your thoughts first, Betsey?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm really glad that we pivoted to talking about climate. And I think that Angela's exactly right, that the biggest problem with climate is there's going to be losers. And so everybody, it's hard to get any sort of policy done because there's always somebody against it, right? And I think if you look at where we've had some international success, we just had huge international success in getting together and agreeing on a global minimum corporate tax rate. Why? Because countries saw their tax revenue fleeing across borders, and we understood that that was a problem. We really need to come together internationally and agree on some sort of carbon pricing. And I think that is a much, much heavier lift, but I think that's really the big reform that's needed. Australia's struggled with carbon pricing. As a big coal exporter, you have the same kind of problem the United States has. We see the Biden administration's pushing on climate and trying to do things to actually make carbon less appealing to people, but are terrified to do it through a tax. I would really love to see us do real carbon pricing in the United States. I'd like to see Australia do it. I'd like to see the entire globe do it, because the truth is every bit of carbon you use is costing us in terms of the environment. And with it not being priced in, we overuse it. But there's it's not just the coal producers that get hurt with that. It's all the heavy users of carbon. And that's why accepting losers and getting that through, I think it's the most challenging big reform we have. But we're already starting to see the effects of climate change around the globe. Maybe the fact that we're feeling them so great in the United States will push a little bit more impetus for the United States to take some action on this. But I think that if you look at young people today, the thing they're most concerned about is that we're not doing enough on climate. Oh, let me just say one thing, because you asked about land taxes. That's a sticky business to get down. In the United States, it's true. We fund all our schools through property taxes, and property taxes are a really important part of our tax base. It's interesting to me because the United States has been very opposed to any kind of wealth tax, except for we have a wealth tax. It's just one that hits middle-class people because it's a wealth tax on our home, on our property. I would prefer countries to move to a broader wealth tax. If you're going to tax wealth, don't just tax the wealth that is in people's homes. Let's tax all the wealth that they have.
Well, Michael, I'm gloomy about the outlook for temperature rises, because I think so much of us is baked in now. But even in the last few weeks, I've become more optimistic about action, global action and action here in Australia. Obviously, if there was a change of government, that would be more meaningful than if there wasn't. But Ross Garnaut's written a book called Reset. And if you look at Australia's kind of natural attributes, yeah, sure, lots of oil and coal and gas, but also wide open spaces, sun, wind energy, capacity to make hydrogen. So the Reset basically says we're really potentially well positioned for a transition to a low energy future. And going back to, don't waste a crisis, there is a reset going on, and it's not mainly within the federal government, but it's within the business community. There's not a lot of interest in investing in new coal mines. There's not a lot of interest in, a lot of those sorts of investments, coal-fired power stations. If you can find, Michael, or anyone on this program can find someone who's seriously saying they want to build a new coal-fired power station in Australia, I'll point you to someone who's lost their marbles. No one wants to, other than possibly the National Party. Now, what that means, going to Betsy's point about carbon pricing, there is actually a carbon price in Australia in the private sector, because whenever they do analyses, cash flow analyses about future projects, whether they're fossil fuels or anything else, they're building in an implicit or an assumed carbon price. They're so clear in their minds that new investments in old technologies is going to, they probably won't even get off the ground because they won't get financing for it. BlackRock, I think, is just the latest of massive, investment houses saying we're not going to do it anymore. So I'm a bit more optimistic, as I say, just in the last few months, just watching the behaviour of the private sector and the absence of really strong coordinated lobbying to cling on to the past and the interest in moving to the future.
Can I just add something to that, which is the thing that has shocked me most is talking to industry, where industry's like, really just get the carbon pricing done because we all know it's coming. I've had exactly that experience, Craig, is they know it's coming. They're already implicitly doing it, and they would find it easier if we could all just agree.
And imagine all these countries, the leaders, I don't know if it's a physical trip to Glasgow, probably is, isn't it? They'll jump on planes in November.
They can, yeah.
and coming back and saying, we didn't agree on anything. You know, it was a disaster, which Copenhagen was a long time ago in, I think, 2009 from memory. They can't afford to come back and say we didn't agree on anything. And I think that they, you know, to pick up Betsy's point again, the business community would be furious if they came back and said, you know, look, it's just all too hard for us. They are expecting, you know, more coordinated action through the Paris Agreement and Articles 6.2 and 6.8, I think they are, which allow international trading in carbon credit units, in which Australia has a very strong comparative advantage. And people are starting to work that out. I mean, you know, in Japan, they won't be able to grow a whole lot of plantations to, you know, store carbon, but in Australia you could. So you help them get to their net zero by storing carbon in Australia. There's a whole new exciting market being formed right now. And if governments could say, here's the institutional framework for it, that would give it integrity and measurability. And it's a whole new industry, but it's a good industry.
Fantastic. Well, I am very conscious that we've gone well over time now, but hopefully we can turn the pessimism of Angela and her recent comments into the optimism of Craig, or with the enthusiasm of Betsy. And I appreciate it, all three of you. I guess I might just throw out are there any last comments you would want to leave with the people at home watching here? Like, what would you leave them to take away?
I just say, I think we've seen over the last 12, 18 months, the power of government and how much government can do and how big it can be. And that should give people confidence that, you know, big reform isn't dead at all, and that we should be optimistic about it and set a high bar going forward. I think the Australian people are ready for it. They just need, I think, the political leadership and will to deliver it. And that's perhaps what's been missing a bit in recent times in Australian politics.
And I'm just going to double down on my optimism. I completely accept what Betsy's saying about how it's taken a while for Australians to confront, you know, what will be a new world post-COVID. But I don't think they're fearful people. I can guarantee you this, there will be a campaign which says, if you elect Labor, the world will fall apart, your life will fall apart, your family will fall apart. We know that's coming. But I think that, you know, as long as you're not genuinely saying, well, you've got to sacrifice this or that or the other thing for reform, and I don't think that's necessary for the sorts of reasons that we've been discussing, I reckon people are up to the idea that we're not going to go back to 2019. We can go forward better to build back better, as Joe Biden and the administration have indicated. Last comment for you, Betsy.
Yeah, I was, you know, on both those points, you know, I agree completely with Angela that what we've learned during the COVID crisis is how well things can work when government pulls together. And I think that's really the strength of Australia, is there is a sense of doing what's right for the community that is really deeply baked into Australian culture, into the Australian mindset. And I think that is really going to serve Australia well going forward. And in thinking about big reform and where you want to be, I think the United States is really wrestling with the fact that we've gone back to our frontier ways, which is a real independent attitude, you know, don't care about anybody but yourself. And that's why you're, you know, seeing not only body bags still being loaded into freezer trucks around the United States, but you're also seeing, you know, people getting into fistfights over wearing masks, over asking each other about vaccines. It's a real cultural problem, and that the US has to wrestle with. And I think if you look across the globe, what you see is that countries where they've been able to pull together with government have managed the crisis better. And that, you know, we're going to need that when it comes to the big crisis we're facing, which is not just, I think, ongoing pandemics, which I do think is a big part of our future, but I think the climate change. And the more we work together as a coherent society, the better we're going to be able to well positioned to do so.
Well, thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us. Angela, Betsy, and Craig, you guys are all fantastic friends of McKell and always fascinating people to talk to. I appreciate it, and I hope that I feel like there was a bit of an upbeat there, and certainly I hope that we're on better days ahead. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you at home for joining us as well at this tough hour. But we appreciate your time. Have a good one.
Thanks for having us, Michael.